Hi, everybody. I have a professor and author here with me, Dr. Randal Rauser, and we're going to discuss his book, one of his many books. He's written quite a few, called Is the Atheist My Neighbor? And so I posted this, or actually I posted a tweet not too long ago, and I said something about Romans 1:20, and Randall responded and he said, is the atheist my neighbor? And I thought, well, I'll just go ahead and buy his book and see what his arguments are, and then I will invite him on my channel. And so without further ado, Randall, would you like to introduce yourself to anyone who might not know you?
Sure. First of all, thanks again for having me, SJ. It's great to be with you. I'm a professor at Taylor Seminary from Kairos University, and that's up in Canada, in Edmonton, Canada. I've written 14 books in areas of theology, apologetics, and things like that. And so this was one of those books, and I've enjoyed interacting with you over the years. And so I'm looking forward to this opportunity.
Yeah, well, great. I've enjoyed that too. I know we've chatted a couple times, and I've watched, actually this morning decided to listen to a couple more of your videos, and so I listened to one where you were talking to Professor Yancey. I forgot his first name, but Professor Yancey, and you were talking a lot about progressivism and that kind of thing. And so I thought I might even try to ask a little bit about that a little bit later as we get going. So this book, it's actually a very, you have an English background, don't you?
I have a degree in English literature, yeah.
Yeah, I can tell, because when I read this book, I can just see the writing is so professional and so well put together. And I teach business communication courses. And so I can see some of the principles that I teach in how you delivered your message. It's chock full of all kinds of stories, and it's got some little zingers in there too. And so you've got, like, you started off right off the bat with this parable of the Good Samaritan, and then you cross off Samaritan and you write atheist. So could you tell everybody why you'd like, how does the atheist get this Samaritan label?
Yeah. So one of the problems with some of Jesus's teaching is that it can become kind of tamed or overly familiar over time. It doesn't quite shock us the way it should. You might think, for example, like somebody who lives in a really amazing setting, like in a mountain town, and if they see that same scenery every day, they no longer appreciate how unique it is. So what they need is somebody to come along and say, wow, you live in a pretty amazing place. And similarly, if you grew up with Jesus's teaching, it doesn't have necessarily the same impact that it should. And so the challenge is to reacquaint ourselves with what he was saying. And the story of the Good Samaritan is one of those examples, because for us, when we think about Good Samaritan, that's just a positive thing. Well, of course, for Jesus's original audience, that was an oxymoron, because they thought of Samaritans as a very negative group, what we would call an out group, people that you look down upon, that you did not want to affiliate with. Mm-hmm. And so when Jesus puts the Samaritan within his parable as in the starring role, he's challenging some deeply rooted assumptions about in-groups and out-groups. And so one of the questions is, well, who are the out-groups for Christians today? And certainly I think one of them is the atheist community, the secular community, the humanist community. So to retell the parable, but now put an atheist into that starring role, is a way of getting us to be reacquainted with the original purpose of Jesus' teaching.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I love that parable. I think that actually is a good comparison. And I have to say, my familiarity with atheists in real life is really pretty limited compared to what it's like online, because on Twitter, it seems like there are tons of atheists, and on YouTube and those kind of places. But online, I just want to tell you a quick story. This summer, I was teaching a class, an undergraduate class, and one of the students was an older student who had served in the military. And on the first day, he announced to me, I didn't bring up Christianity because I teach in a secular university, but he brought up to me that he's an atheist, he announced, and he said something about foxholes. And so I thought, oh, okay, well, that's fine. And so I thought I'd just treat him as graciously as anyone else. And so we were just in the class, and a few weeks later, he tells me, I'm really sorry on the first day that I told you I'm an atheist. And I said, why? He said, that's okay if you want to let me know you're an atheist. And I'd gotten to know him since that time, and I realized what a genuine, sweet person he is. And he said, I'll tell you why I'm an atheist. And he said, it was because he said when he was in the military and he was serving and he was seeing all this stuff and he was praying to God for help, he felt like God wasn't answering his prayers. So he said, I'm just going to go it alone. And so that was his response. And so, but I thought it's kind of nice that I had the interaction with him, because I have a human now that I can attach that I got to know a little bit better. And so that kind of is the theme of your book. And so I'll bring that back. So you have a proposition here, and and you actually provide a lot of evidence of the proposition. So you provide evidence that people are basically denigrating atheists, and they are, in some cases, some terrible cases, they're saying that all atheists are in this class of rebellion, and it's the rebellion thesis you have, and it says here, the rebellion thesis: while atheists prefer to believe that God does not exist, this disbelief is the result of an active and culpable suppression of an innate disposition to believe in God, which is born of a hatred of God and a desire to sin with impunity. So, and you did provide evidence of certainly some people have that belief. And so how would you, but I don't think, are you making the assessment that all people have that belief about all atheists? Are you open to the idea that maybe some atheists might be in rebellion, but others maybe aren't in rebellion? Is that?
Well, so the rebellion thesis is a popular view among Christians. Certainly, I'm a Christian. I don't hold it, so it's not a universal view among Christians. But just to give you a couple examples, R.C. Sproul, very well-known Reformed apologist and theologian, he would tell the story, which I relay in the book, about being invited to speak at an atheist club on a university campus and being invited to give arguments for God's existence. And he says to the group, he says, well, I can give you those arguments, but I just want you to know that I believe you already know that God exists and you hate God. And that's why you're sinfully suppressing your belief in God. And so I'll give you arguments, but I want you to know that's where I think you're at. Another example, Greg Koukl, very well-known Christian leader in terms of apologetics and that. Very popular book he's written, Tactics and Stand to Reason, as his radio broadcast ministry. He has a video where he talks about atheists being like a person who's trying to hold a beach ball underwater, which of course is, if it's inflated, of course. Holding an inflated beach ball underwater is pretty hard, right? You're constantly struggling to keep it from popping above the surface. And he says that's like atheists. They're trying to forcibly hold down their belief in God, and they always have to struggle because it keeps popping back up. Now, there could be people who meet that description. But the rebellion thesis is the claim that every atheist meets that description. And that's where we get in, I think, to a lot of trouble.
Yeah, well, I have to agree with you. I definitely know some who I don't see. I feel like they were in this case where they'd prayed to God and they felt like God didn't answer. And I think that's the whole idea of divine hiddenness. And how just kind of going away from the book for just a second, how would you address that? Have you ever talked about divine hiddenness to any of the atheists or?
Yes, for sure. In fact, so one of the endorsements on the back cover of the book is from J.L. Schellenberg. He's one of the leading atheist philosophers of religion in the world today, and he's the one who developed the argument from divine hiddenness for the non-existence of God. And so the gist of his argument is that there are, in fact, people out there that don't meet the rebellion thesis. In other words, there are people who genuinely want to know if God exists. They're looking for evidence. They hope that God exists. They're open to God existing, and yet they don't find the evidence that they're looking for, and so they end up in non-belief. He calls those non-culpable non-believers. And his argument is that, well, if God exists, God would want to present God's self to all people who are open to his existence and to be in relationship with him. And so there should be no such people that are non-culpable non-believers who are open to God, but yet don't have a revelation of God. So I understand that argument. I understand, particularly from an existential perspective, if you've been that person, that you were praying to God, like you talked about with this student you had who was in the military and felt like his prayers weren't getting through. And you might reason, well, maybe God just isn't there at all. And that's why God's not answering. It does seem to me, however, that there could be all sorts of reasons, maybe reasons we can't even understand, as to why God might withhold his full revelation from people at some point in time. And it could be, nonetheless, that in the end, all people who are open to God will receive that revelation of God and relationship with God. But perhaps God has sufficient reasons to hold back at some times to some people.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a fair thing that we have to look at. It's kind of I mean, for me, it seemed like sometimes it seems like, actually, I heard you talking about this with Mother Teresa. Even somebody at her level, at the saint level, feels sometimes like she's in the dark as far as God. And so you can say that even at the saint level, but then there's little puny, dirty me. And so sometimes you don't feel like, you might have answers. Maybe you've got some really difficult situations going on in your life and you don't feel like God's answering it. But to think that, to me, it seems like a really drastic step to take, to say, okay, maybe there's not a God. I feel like that's like extreme, because I I look outside. I know atheists hate when I say this, but I just look out the window and I see the beauty in the landscape and everything else, and I feel like that's just looks, you can see a handiwork. And so that kind of gets into that Romans 1 argument that I posted on there. If you just look at, like, in Psalm 104 and some of these other verses that tell us that God is our creator, and that if you
Mhm.
deny that, you are suppressing it. And so you spent a lot of time talking about that in Psalm 14. You mentioned even the fool idea and April Fool's Day. And so, which was actually that was kind of funny, I have to admit. April Fool's Day. I've never heard that. At least I don't
Yeah,
recall hearing it.
so for people who don't know, it's the bumper sticker says April 1st is Atheist Day. And then it would have Psalm 14:1, the fool said in his heart there is no God. So that's the day for fools who are atheists. But one of the problems with citing Psalm 14:1 and using it as a cudgel against atheists is that that has nothing to do with what Psalm 14:1 is about. The idea of atheism was not part of the Hebrew worldview at all. There weren't people that were atheists. Everybody was a theist of some kind or another. So when it says the fool has said in his heart there is no God, what it's referring to is people who, while they say they believe in God and they follow God, they do not actually carry through on that which they profess to believe. And the interesting thing to note is that the last part of that verse, there is no one who does good, from that verse, Psalm 14:1, Paul actually quotes that in Romans 3:10 as evidence that all people across the world, all people are sinful. So the point of Psalm 14:1 isn't to single out a group called atheists and to say they're fools. It's rather to challenge every person who professes to believe in God and yet does not live in accord with the beliefs they profess. And that's the great irony, is that we can totally miss the plank in our own eye by using this verse as a sort of proof text for a community that doesn't even profess belief in God in the first place.
Yeah, yeah, and that's true. Actually, it's they actually called Christians atheists back in Jesus's time, because they were people who were non-believers in the pagan gods. And so it was kind of a weird thing when I saw that they were saying down with the atheists when they were martyring some people. And so,
Yeah, I mean that's another thing so atheos in Greek, it did not mean atheist as we understand it today. What it meant was the denial of some specific concept of God, and so Christians and pagans would mutually call one another atheists in the early centuries of the church, meaning you deny what the person we believe to be the true God.
mhm.
But that's very different from atheism in the modern era, where it is meant sort of a categorical denial of any supernatural realm.
Mhm. And I also, speaking of kind of the modern era, like what you're saying, and I'm thinking about your background because I've been listening to some of your videos, and it's interesting because if I had to classify what my beliefs were in my 30s, I probably would call myself a progressive Christian. I sort of believed in this universalist idea. I was reading all kinds of Eastern books. I was kind of a mess, really. I mean, for me, I was, because I didn't know. I was reading books by Deepak Chopra and all this kind of stuff, and Wayne Dyer, and the Celestine prophecy, all these kind of things. And then I had a different experience, and I moved away from being kind of a more liberal Democrat to now I would call myself a conservative. And I know that that's usually, I think that's usually the movement that people make. They go from liberal to conservative over the years, but it seems to me like you're more liberal. And so, and I don't know if you've always been liberal. So I'm curious to see what your background is, or how you say you are.
How do you define a term like liberal?
Oh, that's a good question, actually. Maybe I'll just say, uh, let's see, more leaning to the left, if you just want to say social issues on things like maybe abortion and homosexuality and that kind of thing, gay marriage, and
So, well, this is one of the challenges is that these terms are inevitably relative terms.
mhm.
So one person is more liberal or conservative than another person, And yet, so relative to the context in which you're in, you may be the most liberal person in the room or the most conservative person in the room. So, and yet, what concerns me about the use of the labeling in discourse is that it's often functions as a way to sort of categorize people. So we know who you are, we know where you're coming from, we know what your agenda, quote unquote, is because we've labeled you a liberal or a conservative, fundamentalist or a progressive, and what have you. And really, I think the issues are often very much more complicated than that. For example, you could be a social conservative, you could be a libertarian. Those are very different things. And yet you might call yourself a conservative. And so it's all a matter, I think, of just talking to people, finding out what their views are. There's also the important distinction between social, cultural, political views and theological views. You can be very conservative in one area and very liberal or progressive in another area. I mean, my views, just briefly, would be, I outline them in my book, What's So Confusing About Grace, talk about growing up in a conservative, dispensational, Pentecostal home, gradually questioning a lot of the things that I've been raised with, like young earth creationism, hell is eternal conscious torment, throughout the early 1990s, late 80s, early to mid 90s, rethinking a lot of those theological issues. And so today, I mean, in my more recent work has been rethinking biblical violence and the concept of inerrancy and how one understands that. And so issues like that. So does that make me more liberal than I was in my 20s or 30s? I mean, perhaps, depending on how one uses the term. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I kind of just remembered something that as you're speaking to me, and you reminded me of something that I heard in your other conversation with Yancey, Professor Yancey, is the idea of social justice, because he was looking at a value system. And I kind of want to break into this by talking about Jonathan Haidt's moral foundations theory, because there's a distinction between people as far as which foundations we draw from as we make our decisions. And according to Jonathan Haidt and some of his co-authors, there's these foundations of everyone tends to have the values that we should be caring. Like that's something I've seen in other studies that talks about the value of care for others and also the value of fairness to others. And apparently what he found, and then there's these other values, purity, sanctity, patriotism, libertarianism, that kind of thing, or liberty, I should say. But he looked at those and he realized there's a little bit of a distinction. He said a lot of people who might lean a little more to the left or Democrats, I'll just say Democrats tend to vote more for things on care and fairness, and they don't focus on these other values quite as much. Whereas the other values, it tends to be more of a Republican thing where they might focus on all of the values more equally. And that kind of relates to when you see Trump with his American flags and all that kind of stuff in the military and that big presence. He's trying to appeal to the patriotic side of the conservative, whereas you see with Biden really appealing to the help for the needy and that kind of thing in some of his political ads. And so I'm just wondering if in that conversation you had and kind of blending this idea of another value of social justice, which is kind of related to caring for the harm people who are in debt, or people who are coming into our country or any of those kind of things. So just wondering where you stand along those lines. Have you looked at that study or heard about any of that?
I don't know. I've read The Righteous Mind, Jonathan Haidt's book back in like 2009. And of course, the one thing that sticks out from reading that book was he was lamenting the polarization of discourse in the late 2000s. And I just sort of shake my head now because the last 13 years or so has only seen a further decline in that area. Second observation I would make as a Canadian is we don't have a binary political perspective as in the US, where you have a two-party political system. We have really 5 national parties, if you include the Bloc Québécois. And they represent a range of views. So NDP is more progressive. Green Party's further out than that. Liberal is sort of the mainstream party, then the Conservative Party, and then you have the Bloc, who have their own agenda. And then you have other parties, but those are the main ones. And so that sort of breaks down a simple sort of binary way of thinking about it. The last thing I would just say in terms of the contemporary situation in the United States is that I don't think someone like Donald Trump is classically conservative. Nor would I say I think Ron DeSantis, as another example, is classically conservative. These are, I mean, conservatism, for example, has a strong emphasis upon things like small government And I think both Trump and DeSantis have appealed to government intervening in all sorts of ways. For example, DeSantis using the government to retribute against Disney for taking a stance that differed with his stance, which is quite an extraordinary move for somebody who is ostensibly a conservative to take. And in terms of Trump, I just don't think he actually has any political ideology whatsoever. I think that he's just sort of a narcissist.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. Trump is absolutely a narcissist. And people do have a double standard if they want to go slams Clinton for one thing and not pay attention to Trump's forays. And so I think that I do see that. And I actually am a person who does not want Trump to run again, because I just don't. I don't think that brings value to our country. I think, unfortunately, it brings more division. And so I actually I like DeSantis a lot better if I had to pick somebody. Guess I can say that. He's my governor in the state of Florida.
Well, just as an aside, then, not to get on a rabbit trail, but what did you think of his sending the Venezuelan refugees to Martha's Vineyard in that sort of publicity stunt?
Yeah, I just thought that was exactly what it was, just a publicity stunt. But it's also, there is something to be said. I mean, I feel very sorry for Venezuelans in particular, just because of what happened in their country. Most of them are starving to death right now, and they're living under a regime that's Maduro, that's absolutely violent and horrible. So
yeah, I agree. But my concern is, so someone like DeSantis took these people who were in Texas, they weren't in Florida for one thing, and under false pretenses, he flew them to Martha's Vineyard and dropped them off there, and had his photographer there to take pictures, and then gave them directions for like 2 days later. They have to be in all different places across country for their hearings. I mean, it seems like a pretty cruel way to use human beings. It would be concerning to me.
I am actually for the idea of helping people. I don't think we can have completely open borders, but I think that the U.S. in general has horrible immigration policies. And so I can see these people, just their complete desperation to try to get in here. I do think it was using them. That was definitely a political stunt. And I don't really think that that's a good idea. That's not a way to bridge the gap between our two sides.
It's sort of this mentality of owning the libs, right? Everybody, in fact, is trying to own one another through these kinds of things. And I just think it's unfortunate. Which is, I mean, back to the sort of atheist thing, is learning to talk to one another, learning to steel man one another, to try to understand where the other person is coming from, and set aside some of our preconceptions of other people.
Yeah, well, I think going back to what you're just saying with immigration, the idea that I have been seeing in the universities that I feel that is absolutely tragic is, before Trump came into office, it was very easy for my international students to get jobs once they graduated. Very easy, and never had a problem with that at all with any of my students. And suddenly now I've got students who have an employer willing to secure the visa, and Trump initially, for one of them, wouldn't renew the visa for whatever reason. She had to fly back to Sweden. Very smart student with an MBA, and just really just crazy. This had to happen, and it's still happening under Biden. He hasn't fixed that. So my students now, who come here with the dream of staying in the United States, in many cases get shipped back to their original countries. And Canada, to its credit, is also opening the doors to these students, but a lot of them don't want to be in that cold weather. But Canada's been very good about that, I think. So yeah, I think that there's a brain drain. I think if we had to look at that, I just think that we need some reform in the country, where we definitely at least consider our own college graduates, and that we're losing these brains when we're sending them back to their countries. So, yeah, definitely. I think that's a good thing, right? Although, I mean, historically, U.S. immigration has not been a meritocracy, unlike many other countries, right, where there was a much more merit-based approach to immigration. Yeah, we have to that's definitely an issue. So I want to get back now to your book a little bit, because I wanted to a couple of things. So where it was, you said something like, let me see here, all in sinful rebellion. Where do you think this? Do you think that atheism has anything to do with sort of a rejection of authority, or the idea of there is a divine father watching me all the time and that kind of thing? Or do you think I think here's what I think. I think there's a bunch of different types of atheists that are out there. I certainly see some as the rejecting authority idea, and I see some that are sort of those those souls, like the person that I talked about in my class, who had tried to pray and did feel like their prayers weren't answered. There's some who've just maybe been hurt by Christians. There's some Christians who unfortunately can be pretty awful. There's some who are in the church, who are, say, in the Roman Catholic Church, where I now attend. I've decided to come abound and go back to Catholicism. But there are some who unfortunately have done rotten things within the church. And so there's so many reasons why people become atheists. And so I'm just wondering, do you feel like there's any predominant reasons, or do you think that this is just a sort of a mix and we shouldn't even bother trying to figure out which direction they came from?
Oh, well, I mean, there's certainly a lot of value in trying to understand why people hold the views that they do. And if they're becoming atheists, then why did they become an atheist rather than something else? But I certainly would be careful about doing any kind of broad brush. I mean, to say that, atheists generally have an authority problem, I think is equivalent to saying theists need a security blanket, and that's why they believe in God, right? Like, there may be some theists who that's the description that does apply to them, but certainly I think it's kind of absurd to suggest that's just a general phenomenon about theists. I think what you have to do is get out and talk to people. Yeah, but so then when you do, I mean, you do find out that people do have a wide variety of reasons. So you talked about earlier, like looking out the window and just seeing the beauty of creation and forming a belief that God exists. And you kind of see that coming out of Romans 1:18-20. But other people have different experiences, right? And they see different things. So when I think about atheists, one of the people I often think about is Bob Giono, who was a father, and he was Catholic, and he'd grown up in the church, and then he discovered that his daughter had been repeatedly raped by their priest in their house. And after that, he became an atheist because he couldn't reconcile himself to this idea that God stood by while his daughter was being sexually assaulted by a priest under his own roof. And I can't imagine what that would be like. I can't imagine what it would be like to be Bob Giono. And I don't know if my faith would survive had I undergone that kind of horrific experience. And so when I ask myself those questions and try to put myself into his shoes, it just chastens me about making any sort of simple or sweeping judgments as to why a person ends up an atheist or a Christian.
Yeah, I can say, I'll just go back to the Catholic Church. One of the reasons I was raised in a Catholic church. I was raised in Catholic schools, all that kind of stuff. And I left because of the church scandals. And they were particularly bad in the 90s, in my view, under Pope John Paul. I think it's Pope John Paul. It was particularly bad. And it was like the priests and the bishops and all these people were looking the other way. And I think it's better now, but I hesitate to say that. But I think Pope Francis is bringing some light to the Catholic faith, and I think he isn't going to be tolerant of some of these transactions anymore. And so I feel like the church has been. But what was interesting, one thing that kind of brought me around a little bit too, was looking at the apparitions at Fatima and looking at what these secrets were that Mother Mary was telling these kids at Fatima, and then what's been transpiring. And one of the third secrets, apparently within that the Vatican has not released out so much yet, but people have been speculating about it, is that Mother Mary predicted, unless Russia was consecrated to her Immaculate Heart, that in a proper way by the Pope, that there would be all these wars and things like that. And that went back to 1917. And so, and unfortunately now we're seeing just Pope Francis went over there and he consecrated Russia just this year. And he didn't go to Russia, but he called up the bishops and consecrated it. And another Pope had tried to do that in the 80s, but he didn't do it in a proper way, according to Sister Lucia. And so I'm bringing this around because I think that there's a lot of evil out in the world. I think last century probably was the worst century that you ever had as far as human history, as far as wars and people being killed and all that kind of stuff. And I'm just wondering if I don't know, I think you're a Protestant. Do you pay attention to any of the, have you ever read anything from some of the saints, like St. Catherine of Siena or St. Thomas Aquinas, or looked at any of those Marian apparitions?
Sure. I mean, I teach church history, so I've read a fair amount of things like Catherine of Siena, certainly a lot of Thomas Aquinas. But a few things I would just want to say. First of all, kind of bullet points in some of the things you said. I think Steven Pinker, in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, provides, it's a 900-page book full of data. He provides overwhelming evidence that civilization is getting less violent over time.
Hmm.
And hunter-gatherer societies were multiple orders more violent than 20th century was ever violent. And the medieval period was far more violent than the 20th century. So there's a popular view that kind of looks at certain events like World War I and World War II and then extrapolates, well, this was like the most violent century ever. It's not even close. And I mean, he gives the hard data on that. So I would just say, if you want to read more about that, take a look at The Better Angels of Our Nature, because he does provide excellent data that society is getting less violent over time, even when you have these terrible moments like World War I and World War II. Now, in terms of sexual abuse in the church, I think it's actually, if anything, been even worse since the 1990s. Now, to say worse, I would just not say that it's gotten worse, but that the revelations have been even more horrific. So, for example, the whole Boston Globe investigation was in the early 2000s, and was probably one of the most infamous ones. Or the grand jury investigation into the Catholic Church in Pennsylvania, which implicated, I think it's like, well, anyway, hundreds and hundreds of priests and thousands of children had been raped over a period of 40 years. So, and that was just in the last 4 years or so. So there's certainly been a lot of ongoing revelations that are still very disturbing. John Paul ended his pontificate in 2005. So some of it you could ascribe maybe there, but I think Benedict and Francis have to own their part as well in that. The last thing I would just say is a kind of an aside. I think that, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this, as a Catholic, if you think that God calls everybody to be a Catholic, I have a very simple argument, and I've run this by Trent Horn when I've talked with him about these things. It seems to me that Mother Teresa was right where God wanted her to be in terms of her ministry. It also seems to me that Billy Graham was right where God wanted him to be. And thus, it seems to me that neither Mother Teresa nor Billy Graham misunderstood God's calling upon their life or will for their life. Now, what follows from that is that it seems to me that God calls some people to minister and build his kingdom from within a Catholic ecclesial context, and God calls some people to build his kingdom and minister from within a Presbyterian and Baptist ecclesial context, that being Billy Graham. So what do you think about that?
I think that God led me back to the Baptist church about 10 years ago, because I was no way going to come back to the Catholic church at that time. I was so mad. My dad, my mom, everybody left except for my sister, the Catholic church. And so, and my dad is still to this day will not go back to the church. He's very angry with the way that these priests have been handling things. And so there was no way I could possibly have walked in the door. And so I think God worked through I absolutely know that in that Baptist church, there is God. I mean, there's absolutely this incredible love for God there and a passion for God. And so, oops, I lost him. Maybe he'll come back, hopefully. So yes, no, I think there's a passion for God. I think that God can use various means for us to get to him. And so he uses the vehicles that are there. And so that's what I would say. I want to say hi to people in the chat. Oh, good. Randall's back. Lost him.
Sorry about that. So you're just talking about God was in the Baptist as well. Okay.
Yeah, no, I really think that. I mean, I think that he uses all these different means to get to us. And I kind of like how C.S. Lewis puts it, there's all these different doors to get to Jesus, but I think we all can be united in the fact that we believe that Jesus is at the heart and the soul of all of our faith.
So would you, because this isn't what you're describing to my mind isn't a standard Catholic view being the view that God does ultimately call all people into fellowship with Rome, but you would be of the view that no, God is an ecclesial pluralist, that God providentially and sovereignly calls people into various different ecclesial communities, not just the Catholic one?
I think he could. Yeah, I think that ideally for God, I think it's ideal if we were all in the original faith. I do believe that Jesus said to Peter, on this rock I will build my church and the gates of hell will not prevail. And I think that Peter, and we have a papal succession there. So the ideal situation, I believe, is that all of us go to Catholic church. But the way the Catholic church, it's amazing that the Catholic church is still around with all of it. I lost Randall now again. Shoot, hopefully he'll come back. Hopefully you guys can hear me. Oh, there we are.
It's one of those days. Okay, so you're saying it's amazing the Catholic Church is still around. That's what I heard.
Yeah, it's amazing. It really is. But I do think, I mean, I think it's the original tree, but I think that out of the tree now there are all these different branches that have kind of gone off. And so I do think that God will work through every one of those branches and figure out a way to unite us to him in the next world. So,
okay, fair enough. So,
I do believe in the idea of purgatory. I actually kind of like that belief. So.
Yeah, as Jerry Walls, a Baptist philosopher, has argued, purgatory is consistent with a Protestant view as long as it's not a expiatory or propitiatory concept of purgatory. Certainly, you could have a period of posthumous restoration or sanctification and be a Protestant. That wouldn't be a problem. So I don't think that would be one of the areas that one should divide over. I would have a problem myself with conforming to an ecclesial system in which I have to recognize the Pope as the head of the church, the vicar of Christ, where I have to believe Mary was bodily assumed into heaven, things like that. So I wouldn't be able to accept some of those dogmas.
Yeah, would you call yourself a sola scriptura kind of a Protestant?
Well, it would depend how one defines that. Certainly, sometimes
like the sole infallible word of God.
So sometimes when people say sola scriptura, what they say is that they think the Bible is the sole source of doctrine, and that's a corruption of the Protestant idea of sola scriptura. So the Protestant idea of sola scriptura, I think Stan Grenz, one of my professors years ago, said it well, that Scripture is the sole norming norm for theological reflection. So it is one unique authority. Now, at the end of the day, I'm not sure Catholics and Protestants, such as what I've just described, need be that far apart, because from Vatican II, the sense that not that tradition is a separate authority equal to Scripture, but rather that Scripture always comes to us through tradition, I think is something that really every Protestant should be willing to affirm as well. I mean, as Yaroslav Pelikan said, he's the great Orthodox Church historian, the only alternative to tradition is bad tradition. So in other words, you can't get out of having tradition. So better to be aware of the kind of tradition that informs your theological reflection.
That makes sense. That's a good, and I do like the idea of kind of being more, at least one of the reasons why I didn't come back to the Catholic Church before, I came back to the Catholic Church for a bunch of reasons, which I've gotten into in other videos and things like that. But Mother Mary is very important to me. And that was actually one of the reasons that kind of put me off with Protestants, because I thought that if Catholics worship Mother Mary, that's considered heresy. You're not supposed to worship Mother Mary. But the idea that Protestants and Catholics differ is that Protestants sometimes even deny verses like Revelation 12, which I think to me is quite clearly Mother Mary. So, I mean, it could be symbolic also of Israel, and it could be symbolic of the constellation in the sky as well. But I've had people tell me that is absolutely not Mother Mary. And I think, why be so forceful on that? And so.
Yeah, I've read. I mean, it's very interesting exegesis to use Marian heuristic when you're reading passages like that. My concern from the Protestant side is I do think Protestants have a low view of Mary often, and I think sometimes it's been the old pendulum swinging in the opposite direction, because, like you said, some Catholics, certainly in popular piety, can blur the distinction between veneration and worship. Mm-hmm. And so Protestants sometimes overreact to that by playing down the significance of Mary. And of course, the irony is, as has been said, that a healthy Mariology serves a healthy Christology. If we really believe that God the Son incarnated and become this human man, Jesus, well, then it must be that the mother that gave birth to him is important, because which mother is not important to the identity and formation of their child? So if you really want to take the incarnation seriously, you need to take Mary seriously too. And I think sometimes Protestants do not do well in that regard.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree with you. And so, and I mean, I agree with you on that. And I agree with you that some Catholics do. I mean, I see with all the statues of Mother Mary that I see sometimes in my neighborhood, some people have those outside of their houses and things like that. I think that if they start over focusing on Mother Mary to the detriment of Christ. I think we're supposed to be focusing on Christ, and she is a vehicle that we can work with as far as focusing together with her on Christ. And so,
well, and this is one of the things, of course, with Protestantism, the strong emphasis upon Christ as the one mediator, that sometimes within Catholicism, there's been a focus on all of these other saints as functional mediators to bring us to Christ. So when you have Martin Luther in 1505 caught in a thunderstorm, and he doesn't call out to Christ, he doesn't even call out to Mary, he calls out to Saint Anne. Right? And he calls out to the Mother of Mary to go to Mary to go to Jesus. And so you get this and like a Protestant, and later Martin Luther would say, well, you can just pray to Jesus himself. So while I appreciate I do appreciate the value of the Catholic tradition, for example, in recognizing that the saints that have gone before us are part of a living church through all history. And so you can pray to the saint in the same way that I would ask you to pray for me at a time of need. I could ask some saint of the past to pray for me at a time of need. I appreciate the logic of that. But I would say as a Protestant, we also have to be careful about treating saints in such a way that they tend to usurp or diminish or downplay the mediatorial role of Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's well said. So I have this little comment I have from you it says the Pope and the Atheist. And so you said here, it says, my favorite Francis moment at the most relevant to our current discussion came in 2013. So the Pope basically said that, it says, the Pope began, the Lord has redeemed all of us with the blood of Christ. All of us, not just Catholics, everyone. Father, the atheists, too, even the atheists, everyone. So what do you think? I think that, see, to me, I don't really have a problem with that, because I do feel like Jesus died for everyone. And I think that's what he said. But I think a lot of people did kind of take that, in Catholics, found offense with that. And so I'm wondering, you like that phrase.
Yeah, first of all, I mean, it's been often observed that Francis is not a theologian in the way that Benedict was. And so he doesn't give the kind of precision that somebody like Benedict might have given, or that many of the conservatives would want, in terms of, what are you actually saying here? And that it's the same thing. He said the same thing about the gay community back in like 2013. And the interesting thing was, he said something to the effect of, who am I to judge, and talking about the gay community, and that just sort of a recognition of the way that Christians have historically marginalized sexual minorities. And he didn't change the church's teaching at all. But as a result of him making this sort of invitation to further dialogue with the gay community, he was chosen as Person of the Year by Advocate magazine, which is like the leading gay activist magazine in the world. They chose him as Person of the Year just because he extended an olive branch to have further conversation. And I think that's something that we need, like, with all of these groups. And that's what I do love about Francis's pastoral heart, is just a kind word, right? It's just an invitation to further dialogue. And he was just in Canada, in fact, in Edmonton, where I live here, in the summer, addressing the issue of residential schools. So it was big news in Canada in the last year that the Catholic Church was part of the residential school system, which essentially carried out a functional cultural genocide of the Indigenous First Nations peoples for several decades, really until 1996. And part of that was that these people, Indigenous children, were taken forcibly away from their families and resettled into schools where they're supposed to learn Canadian culture and unlearn their own language and culture. And often these were Catholic-run schools, and they had very high death rates, high rates of sexual abuse of the children and physical abuse and so on. So that in Kamloops, British Columbia, one of these schools, there was unmarked graves of more than 150 children that were found outside the school, of children that had died and never been returned to their families. And so Pope Francis came to bring about reconciliation with First Nations communities in Canada this summer. It's just that's what we need, right? Is the church. We need to own the reasons why the world is angry at us, why the world is often disenfranchised, that it isn't just because they hate God, right? It's maybe because we've been often very poor witnesses and heralds of God's kingdom.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, I think even you can go back, if you look at the papal line, we've got popes who also, the idea is the popes themselves are infallible, and they in the history have done pretty rotten in some cases. So we certainly don't have a perfect history with popes, but the Catholic message is that their doctrine, though, when they create doctrine, that's infallible. Popes are fallible. I think I said that correctly. Popes are fallible, not infallible. Their doctrine's infallible.
Yeah, so someone like Alexander the Sixth, he was one of the Borgia popes, the Renaissance popes, absolutely notorious because he slept with multiple women, completely amoral. He probably was involved in assassinations of his opponents.
Jeez.
Nonetheless, the Catholic Church would say that in virtue of exercising his office, when he spoke ex cathedra, he was without error and so on. Now, Protestant may raise an eyebrow and find that to be not very convincing, but at the very least, certainly the Catholic Church owns the fact that a pope may end up in hell, right? This was, of course, something Dante's Divine Comedy contemplated. So the fact that you're a pope doesn't mean necessarily that you're saved, but it does mean that when you carried out the functions of your office, you did so with the authority of the Holy Spirit. So,
yeah, I just remembered something. Actually, there's two things I want to get into because one thing is you mentioned that you have read Catherine of Siena, and I was wondering, have you read her dialogues?
I can't recall. I mean, I may have read it 20 years ago.
Well, the interesting thing in the dialogues, she's got this, Catherine of Siena, for anybody who doesn't know her, was somebody who was illiterate. And so God would speak with her. She was a complete saint, and God speaks with saints in a beautiful way. And so she had a friend record what God was saying to her in these dialogues. And one of the things that he mentioned was there's like three camps. There are the saints who die and go right to heaven. There's the sinners who still are in favor of God, who are still with God, praying to God, people like me, who would go to purgatory. And then you get cleansed, and then you go to heaven. And then there's this group in hell. And that's the group that it sort of gets sealed in hell at that point. There's no purgatory for them. And that, according to that book, the group that's in there, as they rejected God and they walked away. And so at that point, there's no redemption. And I'm just wondering, because I know I think that goes against what you said earlier about eternal conscious torment and how you don't think that occurs, I believe.
So my view of posthumous judgment is the annihilationist view, that is a resurrection to a judgment that results in the cessation of existence. Okay. Yeah, I don't hold to eternal conscious torment as the view, and there are multiple reasons for that, scriptural, philosophical, and so on.
The other question that I wanted to ask you is, I think we've talked about it before, but I know I've heard it on your videos before, but a long time ago, you had an experience, a dark spiritual experience. And I remember, and I have had two. So I've had one too that just scared the bejesus out of me. And so, and I'm just wondering, the reason I'm bringing it up is because would you want to share a little bit on that with people here?
Oh, yeah, sure. So that would have been, I believe, 1994. I was living in Hokkaido in Japan, doing summer work with a mission agency teaching English. I was living in a room there were two doors to the room. One door was adjoining the church. The other one was adjoining the apartment where the pastor and his family lived, like a parsonage. And I woke up I had a nightmare, and I woke up about 3 a.m. perhaps. And then I heard a voice come from the side of the door where the church was, right up against the door, like it was announcing its presence. And that got me wide awake. And there were very squeaky floorboards in the building. So I was listening to see if there were footsteps moving away and squeaks in the floorboards, but there was nothing. A little while later, I felt something like a vapor coming underneath the door and into the room. And then it settled over me, and I was paralyzed at that point. This is something Japanese called kanashibari. Anyway, and then I heard like a growling sound, and then a voice started threatening me. And then eventually it lifted off. Probably about 2 hours later, when sunrise came, I grabbed the Bible beside my bed, just opened it up randomly. It was a red letter edition, and it opened up to 2 Corinthians 12:9, the red letter words of Jesus to Paul, where he says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." And I took that as a divine word that I would be sustained in the middle of whatever this was. Then I called the missionary in Sapporo, which was about 2 hours away. I was in a small town, no English speakers around, about 5,000 people on the ocean. And so I called the missionary, and she says, "Oh, something like that happened to the person who stayed there last year in that room." And then about 2 weeks later, something similar happened. But yeah, that was the sum of the experience. So certainly it was an eye-opening experience for me. Now I think about these things, and I want to explore natural explanations. So I have had sleep paralysis before, where you wake up and your body, I think it's a condition of atonia, where your muscle movements are inhibited so that you don't act out your dreams. And if that hasn't worn off yet, then you may find yourself temporarily immobilized. And that can quite commonly happen in the early 20s, the age that I would have been at that time. So you could say, well, maybe that was just sleep atonia and a nightmare, and you're kind of blurry, everything, it's kind of unclear, and it's all natural. It's always possible, right? That it was just a wholly natural phenomena. But I would just say, as somebody who has had sleep atonia and sleep paralysis at other times and had this experience, this just stood out as something completely unique and quite terrifying. And I do think it was spiritual. So yeah, that was the nature of that experience.
I've had one extremely similar, and so I can
Hmm.
say I understand it, and I get frustrated actually when people do say it's sleep paralysis, because I felt this extreme pure evil. Like it was
Yeah.
so cold and so evil, it completely devoid of any sense of light or love, pure evil, and it was cold, like freezing cold, and that was in my experience. And I was saying the Hail Mary and the Our Father over and over and over and over, and that's what worked for me. I wasn't. Did you say any prayers at that point?
Oh yeah, for sure. I wasn't able to speak verbally, but yeah, I
But
definitely
in
was
your
praying
mind.
internally. Yeah. Now, interestingly, this kind of phenomena is quite like the experience of an evil presence is quite common with sleep paralysis. But here's the thing that I would want to raise as a question: just because you've described something doesn't mean it's nothing more than that, right? Um, to give another example, so Teresa of Avila, another famous mystic like Catherine of Siena, right? And she had these very vivid visions of God. And some neurologists today speculate, well, maybe what she was having was this grand mal seizures. And so they were simply seizures. Now, here's the thing, though. You could say, yeah, maybe it was a seizure. That's the physiological correlate of what she experienced. That doesn't change the fact that she experienced these incredible mystical visions of God, of Christ.
Mhm.
So we have to be careful about thinking because you explain it in terms of a seizure that it's nothing but a seizure. And by the same token, as a Christian theist who believes there are malevolent spiritual agencies in the world, I would say, even if I experienced sleep paralysis in that instance, it doesn't mean it was only sleep paralysis. That could have just been the physical correlate or manifestation of a supernatural experience.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, you put it very well. And so, I think we both were able to solve it with that same kind of thing. So prayer. And the weird thing was when I woke up, I also felt like something bad was going to happen to somebody related to me. I had,
Mm,
for some reason, I felt like there was some sort of a justice thing where maybe I deserved that, and I was able to get freed at someone else's expense. That's what I felt. And that same day, my neighbor got diagnosed with brain cancer,
mm.
and it was like, and it was crazy because I got up and I told my husband about it, and I started calling all my family members, and then I came home from work that day, and sure enough, everyone was in the driveway crying, and I tell people that, and they say, oh well, of course she had it prior to that and that kind of thing, but it was just the diagnosis on that exact
Yeah.
same day was freaky.
Mm. Yeah. This is so. In one of my books, I look at what I call little amazing moments of providence or lamps. And a lamp is like a sign of divine action in your life where multiple factors come together in a way that looks very chancy, except that it also has a sort of signature of divine meaning to it. So it seems to be significant. And this would be kind of like that, I think, where you have those kinds of experiences. And given, yeah, I mean, if it had just been a diagnosis on any other day, it wouldn't have been significant. But the fact that just that morning you had that experience and it now syncs up so intimately with that diagnosis mere hours later, I mean, I think that that's some example for something that could have been supernatural for sure.
Yeah, it's weird. And I can say I hope that never happens again. I hope it never happens to you again either, Randall, because
Yeah.
I know how you felt because it was unbelievably crazy. I mean, it was like I just that actually scared me so much that that's what one way that we started going back to the church. That was
Hmm.
like, so that was
There,
that
well,
summer
I
of the
mean,
kid.
they're not pleasant experiences, but I think it's also a glimpse behind the veil. And I mean, like you said, the positive fruit that came out of it maybe was going back to church. So these can be the kind of things that jolt people, that maybe get them to reorient or rethink something. Like C.S. Lewis said, pain is God's megaphone that wakes up a sleeping world. Maybe similarly, some of these experiences can kind of shake us out of a lethargy or an inertia and get us moving in a different direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that, I think that's great. So what was the name? You just named another book, and I wanted that you said it kind of related to all of this. What was it called again?
Well, it was just in one of my books, God or Godless. There's just a short chapter there where I talk about lamps, little amazing moments of providence.
Hmm. Oh,
Yeah.
that's great. So we're coming up on an hour. I was just wondering if you wanted to share with everybody maybe some of the projects you're working on, or what your upcoming book might be, since I know you've already written 14 books. You're clearly busy writing.
Yeah.
And then maybe where we can
Yeah.
find, I think I've posted links to your stuff, your where people can find you in the description, but if I haven't, I will. I'm pretty sure
Yeah.
I posted a link to this book that I want you guys to go pick up, The Atheist. Is the Atheist My Neighbor? Because I think it's Randal's way to be a person who wants to offer the olive branch to the other side, and to try to say, hey, let's all work together. Let's start a dialogue. Let's make sure that we're not acting exclusionary, or certainly not acting where we're dehumanizing another population, because we obviously have a terrible history of doing that. So,
Yeah. My most recent book was Progressive Christians Love Jesus Too, and that came out in April. And I've been doing several interviews on that book. Also, last year I had a book, Jesus Loves Canaanites, talking about biblical violence, and I actually have a debate coming up with Paul Copan on that topic of biblical violence on Unbelievable with Justin Brierley. Probably will be on the show in like November, I'm guessing. And then the book I'm working on right now is, I don't have a title, but it looks at the theology and ethics of homosexuality or same-sex relationships, and it seeks to go through a basic framework to show how different Christians end up in different positions on the theology and ethics of that question. So again, this is a part of my commitment to try to get people across deep partisan divides to understand one another better. It's not in that sense arguing a polemical position on the matter, but rather trying to show in a sympathetic way how different parties, using different sets of data, theology, ethics, experience, and so on, that they can arrive at different conclusions. And I think we definitely need something like that on that discussion. So I hope to have that done in maybe a month or 6 weeks, and then have it out shortly after that.
yeah. I think you're right. The idea, the us versus them, that's gotten so bad. It was never like when I was in the 1990s. I'll just mention this idea, kind of building on what you're saying with olive branches across all angles. In the 1990s, I remember back then, I think I was kind of half Democrat, half Republican. I didn't really know what I was. It didn't really matter. Nobody really cared. Listen,
Yep.
it wasn't like an issue that you brought up. And we didn't have these 24-hour news stations that are running this animosity towards each other that we have right now. And so all we see are people trying to jump into camps, and it's going against each other. So I think getting to know other people, talking to other people, no matter where they are, I think that's what opens our eyes to realize they're human. They're also made in God's image.
Yeah, whether it's news and kind of listening to the news channel that fits your political, social views, or whether it's getting on social media and again just interacting with the people who reinforce your views. The danger is that we end up just totally isolated from one another and unable to understand where the other person is coming from. And so we really need to be intentional about breaking down those barriers and trying to understand and engage with other people where they're at.
Yeah, I agree. So good. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. It's a happy Friday. So everybody, I hope you're having wherever this finds you. If it's finding you on Saturday, that's great too. So thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, SJ.
All right. Thank you. So everybody, whether you eat, drink, or whatever you do it all for God's glory. So end the broadcast.